For anyone on the job market right now, or if you're on the flip side hiring, it really feels like something massive has changed. More applications, more candidates, more overload on both sides of the market. Everyone has their favorite explanation. Is it AI? Is it just the fluctuating market? I'm Aaron Terrasas, a practitioner economist who really loves reconciling economic theory with the messy reality of real world business practice. And I'm trying to disentangle the truth from the fear and the spin to really understand how AI has and hasn't changed the labor market. With that goal, I invited my friend Amy Crook to walk me through the nuts and bolts of how AI has changed hiring from a recruiter's perspective. What's the current state of art and where there are still frictions yet to address. We're having a series of conversations about each step in the hiring process and are sharing some of the highlights here. My goal is to learn how AI is changing hiring from the inside out. Here's a little bit about Amy in her own words.
Hi everyone, I'm Amy Crook, and I've been a recruiting leader for about 20 plus years, building teams across various tech spaces. These days, I lead an HR and recruitment consultancy, Stratavis. Check us out. So I've been seeing firsthand how hiring decisions, good and bad, shape the trajectory of a business. So I'm really excited to dive into this topic with Aaron.
Thanks, Amy. I'm excited to have you. Let's dive in. Welcome to our third and final episode, trying to understand what is happening between AI and the labor market, how AI is shifting how people search for their next job and how companies hire. I'm excited to be joined again by my friend Amy Crook to talk about the final chapter in the job search process. We're calling it rejections, offer, onboarding, and ever after. I think this is an exciting place to talk, just because it feels like there have been a lot of innovations in the past, but a lot of the more recent innovations, it feels like they're struggling. I'm not sure they're having the impact that many folks had hoped for. So with that, I guess let's talk about one path that this end could take, and that's rejection. Obviously, that's not never the outcome that anyone hopes for. Um, but how is AI changing how companies reject candidates, Amy?
Yeah, I think from what I've seen in the market at the moment, the experience has become very depersonalized to the candidate. Um, One thing is that this decision time should be met sooner because you've created all the efficiencies in the process that should enable you to make a decision quicker. But you've also got tools that have helped you gather information along the way. And something that I've always really believed in is giving candidates some valuable feedback on the process and maybe why they weren't successful. And that seems to be um, emitted now with automation in the driving seat of the hiring process. It's not going as quickly as it potentially could, especially when you have such a high volume of candidates available. And the rejection experience has been really depersonalized. And after you've invested X amount of hours going through a process, just to get a couple line email letting you know that you haven't been successful feels a disservice to the candidate.
Let's talk about those two different paths, because there's, one path where a candidate applies, doesn't necessarily interview, and they're still not hearing back. So why isn't AI speeding up that feedback loop?
I mean, that's a great question because if you have a tool that helps you track the very best candidates in the pool that match the requisition, it should be easy then to send a notification to those candidates that are not a great match for the role to let them know that they haven't been successful. I wonder if it's a combination of, you know, overwhelming volumes, trimmed down teams.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's taking more time to get to that decision because they are maybe um, not super confident in the tool application at the moment.
Mm.
And so they perhaps want to hang on to candidates until the entirety of the process has been completed, which, as you know, we just stated, is taking a little longer than we would expect in a market like this. But I don't necessarily believe as a talent leader that's the right way to handle your applications. I think if you have like a pipeline that's really strong, I don't think you should be hanging on to the ones that are maybe 75% or below matches to your requisition just in case.
That's
Um,
such a great insight because we always hear these statements like, "Oh, in your applications, there's always a human in the loop. We don't, the AI is not fully making the decision. It's a human making the decision." But in some ways, that human in the loop is slowing down the feedback
mhm.
process. It sounds like from what you're saying.
Yeah, because I mean, 20 years ago, when I first started in talent acquisition, you could um, put in, they called them killer questions at the time,
Mm.
where if somebody answered a question and the answer wasn't how, what you were looking for, they would automatically get rejected. So 20 years ago, we had a capability to let people know. And, that technology is still used now, but you would now have a much more robust tool that helps you assess talent on a much larger scale. Um, I think if it's been implemented in your organization, you need to embrace it, get comfortable with it, be comfortable making decisions so that people know where they stand in the process. Because, um, finding out 4 or 5 months down the line that you've been rejected because somebody's trying to clean up the ATS, it's not a good experience, but
Sure. Let's talk next about the second kind of rejection path, which is obviously a
mm,
lot messier, is after someone has interviewed for a
mm.
bit. Um, getting feedback has always been tricky. Legal risk concerns kind of dominate. Is there any application of AI kind of there? Is it making it kind of more concrete feedback at all?
Not that I've seen. I've seen the opposite, that it's
Okay.
making, the similarity between the experience of being rejected at the beginning of the process and being rejected at the end of the process has gotten greater over time, I've seen. It's become acceptable to send an email to let somebody know that they haven't been successful. And I think that's a real shame because you do have tools that have tracked your conversations, made it clear, where somebody's strengths and development areas are, and they've invested time in the company. So I think having that conversation with somebody to let them know, like, this was the area that you didn't perform as well on, or, something you need to work on if you want to do this role in the future. I think that's really meaningful for candidates. But yeah, we're just not seeing that happen. And I understand a lot of companies are very risk averse when it comes to giving feedback. Uh, that's okay. If you feel that that there's something that is potentially a risky thing to give feedback on, which honestly doesn't come up very often when you're close to the process. You can stick it in an LLM and make sure that you're omitting like anything that could be potentially risky. Um, but you're still having that conversation with somebody to kind of respect their time and what they have brought to the process. And I will say, throughout my entire career as a leader in this space, I was always very um, interested in what people said about our interview process that weren't successful. Because, of course, if you've been offered the job, you're in the mindset that this was wonderful experience, nothing was wrong. But if you have gone through an interview process with a company and you didn't get the job, but you still walked away and felt like it was a good use of your time, the conversations were meaningful, the experience was meaningful. I think that's a testimony to your talent process.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we talked about in the last episode was how exciting it is that there is this new frontier of data collection, transcribing, recording, verbal conversation, interviews. It feels like that's such a potentially fertile ground for innovation. You can think about Zoom or kind of Google Meet or
Hmm.
Microsoft Teams innovating a
Hmm.
product where it doesn't necessarily need to be the interviewing company that provides feedback. It could be one of the video conferencing platforms that
Hmm.
provides interview feedback.
And there
Uh,
are there are tools that will do that.
yeah.
They will analyze the information and conversation and provide it back to the candidate. I think my gut sense is that companies are trying to implement new technology into old processes,
Mm.
and they aren't evolving their process to make sense with the technology that they've invested in. Um, and that's where we're seeing the delays, we're seeing the lack of communication. Um, and, that's something I can definitely help anybody with if they they need
No, I
to.
mean this
Um,
organizational adoption is obviously such a challenge. It reminds me of conversations with lawyer friends about how, I asked them about LLM adoption, and they're like, LLMs, I'm having enough trouble getting my senior partners in their 70s use email.
yeah,
Um, so
yeah,
um, let's
yeah.
let's kind of moving past rejections. Let's go to the
Mhm.
more optimistic path, and that's an offer. So you know you and I are both deeply familiar with compensation tools and all of the different data sets and ML algorithms that have been around for a long time to help us better inform and better target compensation and offers. What's the frontier here? How are LLMs kind of getting us better, kind of more efficient at writing, developing offers, and getting them into the hands of successful candidates?
Yeah, I mean, when you use an LLM to pull data, it's going to pull data from a wide range of sources. And so you're potentially getting, more of a detailed data set, but then you're also potentially getting more of an outdated data set. But I wonder, like, if people realize when you are investing in tools that give you compensation guidelines, that a lot of that data, by the time you get it, is maybe 1 or 2 years old. Um, and we know over the last 5 years, the market has been inconsistent when it comes to talent value. So I think two things. Yes, use the tools that you've invested in to help you have a framework for what compensation should look like in your organization. You also want to think about internal equity, which again, over the last 5 years, we've seen salaries really have a big swing. When we had the COVID layoffs into the Great Resignation, when people's salary packages were really juiced up, to now where because there's such a high volume of talent on the marketplace, compensation packages have gone down. Um, and so you have to make the decision in your organization. Do you want to create those internal equity issues by following the market up and down? Or do you want to use the tools at hand, whether that's a traditional like Radford tool or LLMs to help put together your salary framework? But I think at the core of it is making sure that you have a philosophy around how you approach compensation. And I personally wouldn't recommend that you track the market uh, it, so closely that you end up with vastly different salaries in your organization um, for doing the same job. That's very problematic. But for candidates, it's great. You've got all that information at your fingertips to kind of really see, okay, in this geo, for this skill set, what should I be asking for? Um, Now we see more and more states are insisting on posting their salary ranges, but there's ways to get around that by posting like incredibly wide salary ranges. But hopefully, candidates feel a little bit more confident with how they value themselves, um, rather than kind of relying on older traditional websites to give them that information that sometimes felt really off base.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that you and I have talked about a number of times over the years. It feels like survey-based compensation benchmark is just, kind of a little bit of an artifact of the past at this point.
Mhm,
And so while companies may rely on that as a guide,
mhm,
it's never definitive. The market has moved up and down so much. I think kind of this question of the impact of salary transparency is something
mhm.
I'm very curious about because, it is, you know, coincidentally ironic that kind of the wave of salary transparency and job postings has kind of come around the same time that the market has softened substantially. I'm not sure it necessarily has done anything to improve the um, kind of the market conditions that candidates face. And so, you
Yeah.
have to wonder, it certainly makes conversations easier, but materially in terms of compensation, has it done anything? I think it's worth asking that question.
Yeah. And I think, something that you and I discussed previously was, this is a, a softer job market right now. But also, this is a time to make sure that what you're building as a organization and how you're presenting yourself as a candidate is sustainable, like down the line. Like when things change, which they inevitably do, um, the process that you have put in place, your philosophies around compensation, your um, benefits packages, all the things, and you've done the research. Um, that's why I'm like, I would recommend companies don't track too closely to what's happening in the market because it does change so quickly. And then you just end up with a ton of internal equity issues.
Yeah.
Um, so it's tempting, I know, for organizations to get a deal with a candidate. Um, and I'm definitely, seeing in the market that salaries have gone down significantly over the last
Yeah.
couple of years, as well as kind of expectations going up.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
jobs that potentially a couple of years ago would have been two separate roles are now
Hmm.
like comboed
Yeah.
um, and for less money. So,
Yeah. This is one of the
and
fascinating contradictions between economic theory and business practice is in a lot of classical macroeconomic models, there's this assumption that wages never decline. Um, and, I think you and I kind of in business practice have both seen they decline both in kind of nominal terms and dollar terms when people switch jobs, and they decline
mhm,
in quality terms and quality adjusted terms in
yes,
terms of what is expected of the role, hours, responsibilities, scope, et cetera.
yes, yeah.
Um,
And we
so,
see that with candidates who are turning down jobs that maybe have a little bit more compensation, but they want them in the office 5 days a week.
mm, sure.
We've seen people's approach to that package change. And I think if you're smart, use all the information that you've got at your fingertips to determine what your offering is as a business, but
Mm,
also what you'll accept as a candidate.
sure. Let's touch briefly on kind of two final elements, steps in this journey. Onboarding. It feels like increasingly there is a lot of self-directed learning, kind of AI content creation in the onboarding space. What are you seeing?
Um, I'm seeing us shift back to that for sure, um, which I'm not too confident is the right way.
Why not?
Again, I think why not? Because you want to set up your new hires for success and you want to make sure that you're giving the information to them in those early days that helps them integrate into your organization as quickly as possible. Because as soon as somebody feels comfortable in the environment, the more the quicker they're going to make an impact. And so I've kind of seen us go on this journey over the last, 5, 6 years of, okay, COVID happened, so everything's virtual. And then, okay, we don't have enough people to run this virtual session, so we're going to make it self-service. And then you're realizing, okay, this has an impact on our um, time to productivity, and we want people to be more engaged in the organization and have the information that they need in terms of connections and who's who. So let's bring it back to something meaningful. And I've seen companies, invest heavily in pulling their remote employees into a location uh, to help them feel connected to the organization. And then some companies have gone slowly back to the self-service model. And I think, again, it's tied back to resourcing in organizations. When budgets are tight and headcount is low, some things get compromised in companies. And I think recruiting is always the first place that gets hit because the assumption is we're not hiring as much as we were, so we don't need the same amount of people, which is correct. You don't. Um, but you need to look at the entirety of the process of, application volumes being high that we touched on,
Mm,
um, job descriptions being more complex because we're trying to find different skill sets in the same person, compensation being challenging because candidates who have been laid off that were in, very, high paying jobs and now looking at roles that are maybe 50, 60K less than they were just making. So how do you go about having that conversation with somebody um, to still make sure that it's a opportunity that they would be interested in? Um, but I think it touches on something that you said earlier um, about the best and the second best being kind of
yeah.
irrelevant right
Conversation we
now.
had,
Like,
yeah. Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, just to give people that context, kind of this is a conversation we had recently where, you know, part of my hypothesis of what's going on in the market right now, in the jobs market, is that um, a lot of these AI predictive models look like they're performing well because really kind of false negatives don't really matter. Throwing out a baby, occasional baby with the bathwater is okay in a world where there's just so many babies. Um, the difference between your top candidate and your fifth candidate isn't huge right now because there's so many candidates. Making a little bit of a mistake, selecting between number three and number one
low
is the
impact.
consequences are low. Oh,
Hmm. Yeah, and but that goes back to what I was saying about making sure you have a process that's built for a different market because before
mm,
you know it, things can
sure.
change. Um, but yeah, I think there's a lot of steps along the way that the process and the tools and the resources that you have internally are not connected in a way that's producing great results. So to go back to, onboarding,
Mhm.
you will have a better chance of getting your person productive and making an impact if you invest a bit of time. That's not to say that you shouldn't be using AI to create your content in some regards. You don't, you, I used to in previous roles, have content that I wanted to make sure was, written correctly and presented well and you'd send it off to your brand team and it would take maybe like 10 weeks
Right,
to get to the final thing. Now you can, create content in minutes
right.
to welcome, to support the activity. So use it to create those efficiencies, like use it to make sure that the information that you're providing is meaningful, impactful, aligns with your brand. You can tell chat gpt anything. I mean, getting good at prompting is like the
Yeah,
key. But don't neglect um, the impact that spending a bit of time with somebody when they first joined a company can have on the bottom line.
yeah, yeah. So I guess a little bit of what I'm hearing with respect to onboarding is, go slow to go fast. Start and lay the foundations and that unlocks opportunity kind of further on. I'm also hearing a little bit that, while the instinct from organizational leaders is to think about kind of recruiting as kind of this function that just supports hiring. In some ways, even as hiring has slowed, the complexity of each hire has increased.
Yeah,
And so, we're not necessarily focused on that complexity side of the metric. Um,
right.
let's talk a little bit about the final step, kind of performance management.
Mm,
Everyone I know is using kind of ChatGPT to write their performance and performance reviews, peer reviews, feedback. Obviously, like
yeah.
that's a huge innovation. Um,
Hmm. What a
um,
time saver.
it is, it is.
It really is.
And so, you know, what else? Kind of other applications that you're seeing, kind of innovations that are productivity enhancing, time saving, really changing the game on performance management.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're starting a role, um, I think it should become more common that you have solid goals, like with your leader, of what good performance looks like in that organization. And there's two reasons I think why this falls down. Number one, is unfortunately there's some people in leadership positions that just don't really know what good would look like in their organization. So that's a struggle. But number two, people are wary of having those conversations. They don't feel comfortable giving direct feedback because you can't be successful performance managing somebody if you haven't set any expectations. So when somebody's new in role, it's so easy to put the job description into an LLM and do a 90-day plan for where this person should be, um, and share it with them.
Mhm.
And then that's something that you can anchor to as the person is joining your organization and starting to make an impact. And I would say as well, if conversations, if you're, and this goes on both sides, because as an employee, you potentially may have feedback that you would want to provide upwards that is difficult. You can have the conversation with ChatGPT first,
Yeah.
you know, um, and it will highlight, if you are coming off as a bit defensive or on the manager side, if you're coming off as a bit aggressive, and then you can work on that before you have the conversation live. But the key thing is to use the tools that you have at your fingertips to create goals that are clear for both sides to be working towards and have the conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, this goes back to the coaching part that, function that we talked about in interviewing and in kind of planning for a role. You think about um, HR business partners. You and I were joking about HRBP, GPT,
Oh yeah,
kind
yeah.
of, using those tools as kind of a brainstorming coaching kind of tool for these conversations. That's, really what it's great at.
And people are going to have to get stronger at um, that support that you would traditionally get from an HR business partner as we see companies completely change how that business partnering function operates. Um, I think back to when Dell really slashed their business partnering function and created, an internal chatbot that had all the policies, all the benefit, just loaded all the information in. And if you had a question, that's where you go. There is no person. You go to that page, put your question in, get your information. Um, I think there's good and bad there. I'm a big fan of like human connection. I think that's our last selling point.
Hmm.
Because certainly AI can do things quicker. It sounds great. They can put together project plans for you in a second, but they can't they can't replicate that connection. And so I think the traditional relationship that people have had with their HR business partners has been that of a coach. And people are going to have to start figuring that out a little bit more for themselves and learning how to interface with LLM to get that kind of support, that career guidance.
Yeah.
And become a little bit more self-sufficient to be successful, because the resources in an HR department that you may have become used to if you've been in the workforce for a couple decades may not be there for much longer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what a telling kind of point to wrap up kind of these series of conversations we've had. I've kind of, think back on the three chats about the various stages of the recruiting hiring process and how AI is changing them. And I think a couple things, that stick with me is, first and foremost, no one is happy right now. Not candidates, not hiring teams, not
Yeah.
kind of business leaders, and it feels like it
Mhm.
shouldn't be like that. Um, you know, in some ways, AI should be making all of this better for everyone involved. And I think back to what I heard, kind of in a comment recently from the chief technology officer of OpenAI, who said, you know, expect that LLMs are going to get better over time. And
Mhm.
I think that's like a reasonable expectation that, the more data, more time, they're going to get better.
100%.
They're not
Mhm.
there yet. And I think kind of this is kind of part of the challenge of the moment that we're living in is that, we're in this kind of moment where there's a lot of hope and expectation. And the technology is amazing in many ways, but it's also not quite up to the high expectations for many of these practical applications. So I think kind of this the awkwardness of this moment, when it comes to technological capabilities and realities is one thing that I take away.
Mhm.
A second thing kind of that I take away is that it's come up a number of times in your comments. First, it feels like there's this just enormous gap between what business leaders kind of think and expect versus what kind of technicians and people who are doing the work kind of know. In our last conversation, you mentioned kind of the problem with ATS isn't the CPO, it's the CFO. It's the budgeting kind of and the
Yeah.
for these tools. So that's the
Mhm.
second takeaway, and I guess the third takeaway, and I have to kind of come back to my economist hat. You know, I go back to the statement that you said, which is, good recruiters want to find the best person. And that's true for models too. Any predictive model in ATS wants to find the best person. I think right now, though, because of economic conditions, because of market conditions, it doesn't necessarily matter to find the best person or the second best person or the fifth best person. There's so many people that, erring on kind of going back to what I said, throwing a few babies out with the bathwater, the consequences aren't there right
Mhm.
now. And so there's this weird interaction between technological advances and market conditions, which is, I think, kind of contributing to the sense of, maybe it's working, but it feels like a lot is being lost in the
Mhm.
process. Um, that's some of the things I take away. Amy, anything that you'd want to add kind of beyond that?
Yeah. I mean, as somebody who has evaluated a talent acquisition function and implemented tools to help create efficiencies, because um, I was very much in that position of application volumes increasing exponentially, but there was no extra hands to, the headcount wasn't going to grow. So, as somebody who's been in that seat, I would just encourage companies to not try and put new technology into old processes.
Hmm.
Think through the process um, from the beginning. See where those opportunities are to eliminate some of those repeatable, low impact in terms of human experience um, points in the process, and don't neglect the the touch points that need to happen to make sure that you're moving quickly. It doesn't, it's okay if if you don't care if you have like the third best candidate. Great. Have that as your philosophy. Be open and honest with that with your team. Get those rejection emails out. Let people know where they
Hmm.
stand. Move the process forward. But just implementing a couple of tools and hoping it all takes care of itself is not going to set any company up for success, particularly should the market change and then you're dealing with a very different approach to candidate experience. So even if you don't care if you get the best candidate and you don't care if the candidate experience is terrible and you're going to get, named and shamed, um, at least care that the process moves. And so having a shepherd in the form of a recruiter to make sure that what you're getting through those touch points and that communications are clear and prompt. Um, I would, that's my advice as somebody who has done this in for an organization. You have so many resources at your fingertips to help you think through how you implement this. Don't neglect being thoughtful about the impact that it has on uh, candidates and hiring managers, because that tends to be what slows people down. If you don't have somebody also, shepherding the hiring manager, you risk, slowing your process down.
Well, thank you. Amy, I certainly appreciate your humanity and appreciate your time, experience, and expertise on these topics and helping me understand what's happening as AI shifts all elements of the labor market. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yep.
See you soon.